All right, and again, thanks to everyone for joining. Um, this is again our first Called by Faith webinar with the JRLC. Um, we have Billy Critchley-Menor here with us tonight, who's going to speak about how his faith has called him to social justice work. During the webinar, you will see and hear me speaking. You will hear Billy. As panelists, you'll see us on your screen, but otherwise you won't see or hear other attendees. Again, please feel free to write in the chat, let us know where you're coming from, post comments. If you have questions, feel free to post those in the Q&A. Oh, and I already see we've got one. How can I add a friend to your email list? You know what, Barb? I can drop a link to you for our website, and then there's just a simple subscribe button at the bottom of our website. That's probably the easiest way, and that will automatically put you on there. Otherwise, you can email me with an email address to add, and I can automatically put that into our MailChimp account. So I will add my email there as well. But that's a great question. We would love to have more folks on our email list. So I'll put my email in there for everybody. That way, just throughout the night, if you have things you think you want to talk with me about later, please drop me a line. All right. Thanks again for everyone joining us. I think we'll get started since we're a couple minutes past the half hour. Again, as I mentioned, I'm Mary Baumgartner. I'm the statewide organizer at the Joint Religious Legislative Coalition. We're thrilled to have you all with us tonight for our first Called by Faith webinar. This series is going to focus on individuals from our various faith traditions who are going to share about how their faith has called them to social justice work. And we'll explore a series of questions throughout the night. Our first presenter is Billy Critchley-Menor. I'm really excited to introduce him because he is actually a lifelong friend of mine. So we know each other dating way back to our grade school days. But before I have Billy go into introducing himself and sharing about his experiences, I just want to give you all a brief update about where we are with the legislature. So you may have heard that we have another special session coming up on October 12th, so this Monday. Again, Governor Walz has extended his peacetime emergency powers for another 30 days. And whenever this happens, this automatically triggers another special session. So one thing that we've really been advocating for, you've all been helping us ask our representatives for, is a bonding package. And we just received word this afternoon that Senator Senjum, who chairs the Capital Investment Committee, has said that there will be a bonding bill that will be to the revisers and available for proofreading by the caucuses as early as tomorrow. It's looking like a smaller package of about $1.4 billion. So we want you to continue reaching out to your legislators and encouraging them to include significant funding for bonds for housing. So please continue to do that. Send them a phone call, send them an email, let them know that there's really this need for housing in your communities. But we'll be keeping an eye on that. We'll keep you updated as we learn other things as well. So if you have other questions on session, again, feel free to send me an email. Feel free to write us a note, even in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll make sure that gets addressed. But without further ado, I want to pass it over to Billy, who will share with us about his faith, about himself, and we'll have a good conversation about how we're called to social justice.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary. I'm going to try and share my screen here. There we go. Perfect. So yes, like I said, thank you, Mary. I'm excited to be here. Mary, like she said, we go way back. We were in elementary school together, and so we've known each other basically forever. And I also go way back with the JRLC. My mom is on the board for JRLC and has been involved with it for many years. And I actually grew up attending JRLC Dan the Hill. Here's a picture of me at some point in high school at Dan the Hill. I enjoyed it much more than that picture makes it seem like. But I learned a lot going to Dan the Hill. And I grew up in a family and in a community where things like legislative advocacy and social justice were always rooted in and connected to my faith. My mom, who's there in the polka dot shirt, she brought us up by taking us both to the really important spiritual and devotional aspects of our faith, taking us to liturgies and the celebrations of the sacraments. But she also brought us to anti-war protests and legislative advocacy days. And we would get to go to Dairy Queen whenever we went to the Sacrament of Confession, and we would always stop for Dairy Queen on the way home from Day on the Hill. So I grew up very exposed to both of these environments, and was also taken by them. I was very fascinated and drawn by the liturgical and spiritual life within the Catholic tradition, and at the same time also personally felt very passionate and called to this long tradition of social justice and the social tradition within the church. And that eventually, I should say, for as long as I can remember, I actually felt a call to priesthood. And Mary will remember me probably talking about that in kindergarten or first grade. But that was always on my heart. And it was rooted both in this love for the sacramental life of the Catholic tradition and in this prophetic tradition of social justice. And so eventually that led me to a vocation within the Jesuits, which, for those of you who don't know, is a religious order of Catholic priests and brothers who take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. And we live together in community and are engaged in a variety of different ministries with the poor, teaching in high schools and universities. And so this is a picture of me making my first vows in 2017, actually in St. Paul at the Church of St. Thomas More. So currently I am in St. Louis in the Jesuit community here, and I'm studying at St. Louis University, which is a Jesuit university. And I'm still engaged and still taken by what I mentioned earlier from my childhood, this connection to the spiritual roots of Catholicism and its social tradition. So currently I'm engaged in work with an organization called the Jesuit Anti-Racism Sodality, and another organization within the Jesuits called the Slavery, History, Memory, and Reconciliation Project, both of which seek to examine our religious order's connection to the problem of racism in the present day, and also our connections to the historical problem of racism, including slavery, and how we can be accountable to victims of racism. And one of the questions that Mary has asked me to think about is what passages from the scriptures, from the Christian scriptures, speak most to me. And this is a question that has a different answer for me at different times of my life and of the year. But the one that is most profound, I think, for me, that has spoken to me most deeply, personally, but also in its connection to social justice, is the story of the Lord's Nativity, which we celebrate at Christmas. And the Nativity reveals what Pope Francis refers to as a revolution of tenderness, which he's called for. A revolution that understands the tenderness of God. And we see this in the Nativity. We see the depth at which God longs to be united with the human family, so much so that this enormous, all-powerful God is going to take on the messiness and the limitations of our own human bodies, which is incredible to me. But it's also deeply instructive that God does not just take on flesh, that he takes on a specific flesh, that the way God wishes to reveal himself as a human is in the vulnerable, helpless body of a poor immigrant child. And that this is very instructive for those of us within the tradition who long to imitate that God and follow that God. And the second scripture passage that has spoken to me deeply, which is perhaps less well known, is the story of Jesus healing a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath day. And he's in the synagogue. It's in the Gospel of Luke. He's in the synagogue. And there are scholars of the law who are trying to catch Jesus to show that he doesn't really know the law. He doesn't know what he's talking about. For to heal this man on the Sabbath would be a violation. And Jesus basically says, is it not better to save life than destroy it? And I think what I see in this passage is is the priorities of Jesus. It reveals who and what he is most concerned with, which is the flourishing of human life. Um, and, and that the place in which Jesus judges laws and customs of a human community is through the lens and the experiences of those who are most disenfranchised, those who are hurting the most. And so these are the two passages that help me answer this other question about how my faith calls me to social justice. And I think, my faith doesn't necessarily call me to an idea of social justice, but it first calls me to an encounter with God. And the God that I meet in this encounter, in this spiritual life, is a God who most closely identifies with the poor. And that then informs the encounters that I have with the rest of the human family and how I understand my life in the human community and in a society. And so the two principles that I get from that encounter with God that instruct my understanding of social justice are first a proximity to people in a society who are marginalized. According to the scriptures, as I've mentioned, I see God identifying himself so closely with the poor. In story after story, Jesus is walking towards the marginalized, first at his own birth and then in various stories afterwards. And in the Catholic tradition, we call this the preferential option for the poor. And the way another Jesuit, Father Greg Boyle, who runs an organization called Homeboy Industries in Los Angeles, which works with former gang members and formerly incarcerated men and women, he says, we move ourselves closer to the margins so that the margins themselves will be erased. We stand there with those whose dignity has been denied. And we locate ourselves with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless. And we situate ourselves right next to the disposable, so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And so when I think about where God calls me in this question of social justice, it's not first an idea, it's not first a set of policies, it's first towards a location of proximity to people who are on the margins. It's to the margin itself. And that, I think, for me, has been deeply impactful, being evangelized and being taught by the stories and the experiences of the poor. And the second way that my faith calls me to engage this question of social justice is what comes when I'm at the space of the margins, which is a challenging of laws and structures that limit the flourishing of people who live on the margins, challenging the laws and the structures that create margins themselves, that leave such great inequalities between the rich and the poor, such great inequalities between white Americans and people of color. And so this is sort of the second way, this challenging of laws and structures. And I want to share a story that shows both of these examples, the proximity to the marginalized and the challenging of structures. So I grew up, actually, I don't know if I mentioned this, but I grew up in Duluth, Minnesota. And I grew up in a pretty white community, in a white school, in a lot of white spaces, in a white church. And it wasn't until the killing of Trayvon Martin, who's here on the screen, in 2012, when I was a sophomore in high school, that I became attentive to the issue of racial injustice and racism. And the way in which that happened is that after the killing of Trayvon Martin, I went to a community forum that was put on by Black community organizers in my city. And it was entitled How to Kill Legally. And the main organizer of the event was a young Black woman, and she was telling a story of how she fears for her younger brother walking home at night in Duluth. He was the same age as I was at the time. And she said she fears that he could be racially profiled and even shot for walking home, because a Black man walking with his hood up is suspicious activity. And what I remember most from that encounter, in that space of people who had a different experience of race and racism than I had, was that that fear and that consciousness was something that had never risen in my mind. I had never been afraid of the police growing up. I had never thought that I needed to be afraid um, walking the streets of the city of Duluth at any time. And that it was only by going to places and listening to people who were on the margins, who were themselves victims of racial oppression, that I began to understand and be taught about the problem and the realities of racism, which then led to my organization, or my membership in an organization in Duluth that worked to challenge the problem of segregation in our public school systems, and has continued to impact my thinking in the present of questions about racism within the Catholic Church. Hearing the stories of Black Catholics, racism in their own church communities, and has inspired my sort of willingness and zeal to resist such realities. And some of the challenges that come along with social justice work are, in my mind, pictured here. You will probably recognize the Minnesota State Capitol. And then this house in North St. Louis, where I've been privileged to do a lot of work in the last few years, which is called Karen House, and it's a Catholic worker community, which is a homeless shelter for women, children, and transgender folks in the city of St. Louis. And at Karen House, there's the opportunity to be in this proximity to the marginalized, to really feel and see and be taught about the lived experience of those who are on the margins. But there's also a call to be in spaces like the Capitol, to resist and to be knowledgeable about the structures and the policies that create inequalities. And that the tension or the challenge is not to be too rooted in one or the other, not to be too rooted in the spaces of power, even when we are advocating on behalf of the poor, because it's so easy, I think, for those of us like myself who grew up in relative privilege, to be cut off from the lived experiences of people who are marginalized. I was just reading the book The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander about the problem of mass incarceration. And she talks about one of the reasons why the issue of mass incarceration for so many years was not at the forefront of the civil rights agenda was because after the civil rights movement, a lot of civil rights lawyers became very embedded in the political system and in the halls of legislature. And they became out of touch with the lived experience of Black poor families. And they were missing the fact that so many young Black men were being incarcerated for nonviolent crimes. And so this is a challenge, I think, for all of us who are engaged in this work, to always be rooted in the stories of people who are marginalized, and to take their lead, to learn from them. And another challenge, which I didn't mention, is I kind of spoke to it, is this within myself of a complacency or propensity towards comfort, which would distance me from speaking more about social justice or engaging more in social justice. And so this question about what does the call to justice in my daily life look like is both very hard to answer and also very important. It's a critical question. And Mary was speaking at the beginning about JRLC is going to send you emails and updates about the bonding bill and, things that you can call your legislators about to increase, funding for housing. So I get all the JRLC emails, but I'm not in Minnesota anymore. But I get emails from all sorts of organizations like JRLC with things that I can do to advocate for policies that are being debated in the legislature. And it is very easy to delete those emails. it's very easy for me um, to ignore them, to not be inconvenienced by them, because the reality is that frankly, they generally are about policies that do not affect my own life very acutely or very specifically. They affect the lives of people who are more marginalized than I am, and and so this call to social justice comes when I get these emails, and I have to say, am I going to receive and react to this email based on my own comfort and my own sensitivities and my own needs? Or am I going to respond to this email based in the stories of the people who I've accompanied on the border, the southern border, based in the stories of people who I've come to know at Karen House, many of whom are homeless, for example. Um, so that's one way in which this call manifests in my daily life. And the other, which is perhaps less concrete, is being attentive to where voices of marginalized and oppressed people are speaking. So in my studies, for example, um, the books and the narratives that are published in my classes are published by certain people for certain people, and often require a questioning of, of, of what agenda is behind them and where the voices of people who are most oppressed are included. And that's a very specific question that I need to insert into my studies on a daily basis. So those are two semi-practical ways that this comes into my daily life. And then I want to talk about a group of Catholics who have deeply inspired me in this work. So this is a picture of a group called the Springfield Dominican Anti-Racism Team, or a few members of it. And the woman who's smiling there, her name is Sister Mary Claire Fichtner, and she is a member of the Springfield Dominican Sisters, a religious order which actually founded the elementary school, which Mary and I attended. So one of Sister Claire's sisters, one of her religious sisters, taught Mary and I how to read. But this religious order, many years later, when I was getting back into or starting in racial justice work, had become mentors for me in this area. They, about 20 years ago, started this group within their order called the Springfield Dominican Anti-Racism Team. And they were recognizing that very few Black women were entering their order, that in the city in which they lived, there was a great income inequality between Blacks and whites, and they didn't want to be feeding into that unjust system. So they hired a consulting group, an anti-racism consulting group, to help them think about ways that they could divest from the forces of systemic racism. And there are so many really beautiful stories that I could tell you about the Springfield Dominican Sisters. But one is again very practical, how social justice has manifested in their life. About 10 years ago, they were going to build a new building on the grounds of their mother house. And this anti-racism team of the sisters said, how are we going to build this building in an anti-racist way? Which is a question that frankly would never come to my mind when asking, how we're going to build a building. But the sisters knew that the inertia of decisions were based often in this unjust system. So how could they leverage their power? So what ended up happening is, with the construction company they were working with, they wrote a contract that required the construction company to give them quarterly reports showing that the building for their mother house was being built by a diverse workforce. And so they were able to leverage their money and their power and their resources to thwart a system that they saw as giving more opportunities to white people than to people of color. And all of this for these sisters has been and is rooted in their Catholic faith, in this desire to be in companionship and in solidarity with the people who are oppressed. And Mary asked what advice would I give to people working in social justice? And I can only give advice that I've received uh, from other people. This is Sister Mary Antona Ebo, who was a civil rights advocate. She marched with Dr. King, and I had the privilege of meeting her a few years ago, just before her death. And I was speaking to her about how inspired I was by all of her civil rights advocacy and her work for racial justice within the Catholic Church. And she was very old, and she was in a hospital bed when I was speaking to her about this. And she looked at me and she said, well, yeah, okay, that's all nice and everything. Um, all that work was good, but you just remember that God needs singers too. That God needs singers too. And I was sort of put off by that at first, thinking, no, Sister Antona, this isn't about singing. This isn't about praying. This is about, doing the work, changing the systems. And what Sister Antona was teaching me was not to get far away from the spiritual roots of my tradition, to never give up or never underestimate the importance of spiritual nourishment in the work of social justice. And that if we do, we risk falling into, I think, this way of proceeding where ideas or policies are more important than people, and more important than our human and spiritual connections to other people. And so that's some advice that I would share with you from Sister Antona Ebo. And then the last bit of advice that's just occurring to me now is that, since being involved in JRLC, a lot of my social justice work is not connected to legislative advocacy anymore, but it's connected to looking at social injustices within my own religious order, within my own church, within spaces in which I inhabit my school. And so to think about where social injustice is popping up, not just in the legislature or politics, but your workplaces and your worship spaces and your own traditions. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Mary. I'm sorry if that was too much or a lot, but thank you for listening. And again, I'm grateful to be able to share.
Thank you for that, Billy. That was amazing. No need to apologize for anything. Thank you for sharing your story with us and offering some perspective. At this point, we will turn it over to question and answers. If folks have questions for Billy, if there's anything that his talk brought up for you that you'd like to learn a little bit more about, or something you'd like his thoughts on, please feel free to write that in the Q&A. Right now, one thing I'm just wondering, Billy, you're doing work that's anti-racist focused. You're on the ground for a lot of things, working with people who, as you said, are at the margins. I imagine that, a lot of these topics by society are considered controversial. So are there things that you've learned and tools that you utilize when you encounter people who, don't necessarily agree with you on these issues, or bring the life experience and empathy that you may have, someone who's not at this point in their own journey? How do you handle those kind of encounters?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're absolutely right. A lot of, of course, in our country, any conversation about racism today I think is quite controversial, but it's not a conversation I think that we can shy away from, or certainly, that we can shy away from. And I think something that helps me in dealing with that tension is sharing that, rooting the conversation in lived experiences of people. So, I generally share my own experience as a white person of benefiting from a lot of systems and a lot of privileges, um, and being taught by other people about their own experiences of feeling marginalized, like the story of the community organizer which I shared. And so rooting it in people and locations and stories, so that it's not just about policies or statistics. Um, and yeah, so I think maybe that's what I would say is rooted, always trying to root things in stories and people.
Thank you. I think that's great. I think of one thing that I was often taught through school is like speaking your truth. And I think that flows nicely with the points that you said about, sharing from your experience and that those have shared with you. We do have one question from Greg Spofford. It makes me laugh a little bit. It's very kind. Um, he is wondering what you see in me that inspires you towards your wonderful servant leader approach towards towards God's people in need. Um, and so Greg and I work closely together, and so he's wanting you to share a little bit more about me.
Yes. Um, I love this question too. You know, one thing that's great about this webinar is it gives Mary and I a chance to talk more because we haven't lived in the same state for a number of years. But I'll start with the first thing that comes to my mind, which is knowing Mary in middle school, and Mary is like the most organized person that I have ever known, and um, and I think Mary has used her talents, her gifts, her skills um, for other people. Mary, I don't know. I mean, I'm inspired of the work that Mary's doing. First off, JRLC. She should probably be giving this talk because she does more social justice work than I do. But I think, yeah, I would say that her sort of tenacity and her energy in engaging with issues and with I would say like an intense analytical or uh, um, a she's so precise, and I think that comes across in her organizing, in her activism or advocacy. So that's what I would say about why Mary inspires me.
Thank you, Billy. It's very kind of you. I appreciate it. um, yeah, thank you. So we have another question, a couple other questions, which is great. Thank you, folks. Bob is wondering, what are some of the values of the Catholic workers movement that attracted you to that group?
Yeah, that's a great question. The Catholic Worker Movement, for those who don't know, I should say, was founded by Dorothy Day and Peter Morin in the 1930s, and it's a movement that works for the advancement of the social tradition within the church. And so there's a lot of houses of hospitality, like Karen House here in St. Louis that I mentioned. They're also very much engaged in civil disobedience and nonviolent protest. In fact, here's a picture of Dorothy Day being arrested at a protest with the United Farm Workers. And the values that I saw in the Catholic worker movement were, first and foremost, what I mentioned in the talk is this close proximity to the poor. The Catholic workers themselves live in pretty intense voluntary poverty, um, and they do not compromise on both resisting and uh, trying to not participate in any sort of system that is unjust. So a week from today, or a week ago today, a woman named Sister Ardith Platty, who was a member of the Catholic worker community in Washington, D.C., passed away. And she was a longtime anti-nuclear activist who spent many years in jails and prisons for her advocacy and for her protest of nuclear weapons, which she saw as threatening the life of people who are most vulnerable. So that sort of fearlessness and um, tenacity to follow the works of mercy and the works of justice in one's own personal life, giving up of their own property, their own privileges, and then engaging in resistance to anything that would hurt other people, I guess.
Great. Thank you, Billy. Um, Karen is writing that other than JRLC, have you any ecumenical connections, experiences, organizations, or thoughts that would be helpful in anti-racism / social justice? It's a great question, Karen.
Yeah, that is a great question. The organization that comes to my mind is called Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizing, which is a consulting group within the Midwest that is, I think it was founded by a group of Lutheran pastors or a group of Protestant ministers, I believe. Um, and they do anti-racism workshops all over the country, but they also provide consulting services for organizations or institutions that are trying to deal with the question and problem of racism. So the Dominican sisters, who I mentioned, they worked with Crossroads in over the last 20 years, trying to figure out what they could do within their own order to resist racism as it was manifesting in their own religious order. So that I would say that's one place to look towards is Crossroads. And there's a lot of others that I'm certainly not aware of, but that's the first one that comes to my mind.
Thank you, Billy. You know what? That looks like all of our questions for right now. If others have them, please feel free again to continue dropping them in. If we think of them later, we can certainly relay them back to Billy and follow up with you afterwards too. So thank you for all of those questions, and please keep them coming. At this point, I'm going to thank Billy once again for joining us tonight. It's been wonderful to have you. But before we wrap up, I want to pass this over to Ann Krisnick, who is the JRLC's Executive Director, and she'll just have a couple final thoughts for us all.
Great, thank you, Mary.
Yeah, thank you, Billy.
I want to thank William again for joining us. And I think you did a wonderful job of starting out our new webinar series. And we know from our readings and from the work we do with each other on our board and across all of the things that we do, that all of our traditions have this wonderful commitment to human dignity and to justice. And there's such a commonality and so much to learn from them. And so I look forward to hearing how the other webinar talks go as well. So you've been an amazing inaugural speaker, and thank you so much for doing that. I want to reach out to everybody on the call and just follow Mary's comments. So, and my dog, you hear my dog running. All of a sudden, she's decided now is the time to speak. So, but I want to make sure that we get as many calls to legislators before Monday about the importance of a bonding bill that includes funding for affordable housing. So we know that there's a bill being drafted right now, as Mary said. Senator Senjem, who chairs the Capital Investment Committee, Representative Senjem in the House, is working with the reviser on that bill. So we want to make sure they're getting a lot of good kudos. I'm so sorry about the dog here. And then once a bill passes, if it includes housing, you'll be getting emails from us saying, please reach out to those same legislators and say, thank you for passing this bill, which can often be a much harder call to receive. So you hear people talking even about prayer, that there's a line, the request line that comes into God is always ringing, and the thank you line is not nearly ringing so often. And so I think that's good for us to think about, not only in our spiritual life, but to think in a very practical sense of the advocacy work that we do. So in addition to thanking Billy, as I hear from him from your mother, or William, as we hear from him in this situation, I also want to thank Mary for really doing the work for the first of our series, and thank all of you for tuning in. We're really glad to have you, and we look forward to talking to you again soon as we move through our next sessions. Have a good night.